Okay, so I've had this handed in front of me. It is some pre-written text by Weird. So here we have Aaron reading Weird script. Some people called it a beef. Others saw it as a friendly discussion, but Ian McCollum of Forgotten Weapons and Logan Medish of High Caliber History got into an exchange about museums in the modern era. I being Weird, of course, sat down with Logan to get his take on what a modern museum curator does behind the scenes at your local museum.
I would like to welcome back to the Assorted Calibers Podcast, firearms historian Logan Medish. Logan, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty darn good. How are you today?
I am doing good, but Logan, you started a little beef.
A little beef, big beef, quarter pounder, third pounder. Where's the beef? What?
Yeah, since we both know Ian McCollum very well, I knew under no circumstances there was a beef, but some people thought it was a beef. I'll have it linked in the show notes. It's too long to explain, but Ian made some fairly controversial, and he knew they were going to be controversial statements about museums and their usefulness in the day of the internet. And of course you had a brilliant rebuttal video that again, there's just too much to go into. They'll both be in the show notes because they're awesome. But one of the things that got into is Ian mentioned that he felt that museum curators really were doing more mundane tasks than doing the more important tasks of a museum curator. And I think you had a little bit of an issue with that, didn't you?
Yeah, a little bit. And you touched on it a little bit here, but I just want to reinforce it. Yeah, I know Ian, he knows me, and I watched his video, and before I sat down to record mine, I texted him and told him, hey, I watched your video. I'm going to do a response reaction video, just a heads up. And he was like, yeah, cool. Send me the link to it when you're done. I want to check it out. So it's one of those celebrity beefs that we both do to get headlines and tabloids and all that good stuff. But anyway, no, yeah. So he was saying that museum folks, spend a lot of time, bogged down in red tape, and they don't have a chance to do as much original research and things of that nature as one might hope. And to a certain extent, yeah, that's true. They say, well, is that true? And you say, well, short answer, yes, with an if, long answer, no, with a but. And it depends on the size of the institution that you're working at, and it depends on your specific role. Museum folks tend to wear lots and lots of hats. The smaller the museum, the more hats. So you may have less time for, research and writing if you're also the head toilet scrubber and tour guide, as well as the curator. But if you're at a bigger institution, you are more solely focused on the collection items themselves, and you have a little bit more of a free reign, if you will, in your day to focus on your actual job interests and the items in the museum themselves.
So honestly, what I really wanted to get down to is when I heard that response, I really wanted to hear, especially since you have worked in I know you've worked in the NRA museum. Have you worked in other firearms museums?
Not other firearms museums, but I've worked in a number of other museums of varying sizes. I worked in a historic house museum, with just a handful of people on staff. And, I did everything from cataloging archaeological objects to, restocking toilet paper and giving tours. I worked for the National Park Service, specifically just working with museum collections. And I worked for the Smithsonian Institution at one point as well, working just with museum collections and cataloging. And again, the Park Service and the Smithsonian are the much larger institutions, obviously, where you get to specialize and focus more specifically on your stuff as opposed to having to wear many, many hats.
Mm-hmm. So I guess since it's the Assorted Calibers podcast, we could corral it tighter to the firearms things, but obviously just museums in general is also kind of the purview of this. Is what are some of the day-to-day, not mundane tasks? Obviously, you might be giving tours. We if we've been to a museum, you've seen a museum tour. We understand what that is, and just about all of us have scrubbed floors and dusted things and cleaned toilets. if that in fact was the purview, and trust me, I've had half a dozen jobs where I did a little bit of everything, but. As far as the specialty side of it, and I would actually say more on the behind the scenes, like what is it that happens behind those employees only doors at museums that we might not know about?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot more hands-on with the collection than you might think. And some of that is just making sure that the collection is still in proper order and that things are still being well cared for. Or sometimes, where we have a research inquiry, someone from the outside is curious about a certain aspect of a piece. For example, like someone is curious about a Palmetto single shot pistol and trying to figure out if the parts are, if it's legit or if it's repro or things have been changed. So, we might end up disassembling the gun and, how thick exactly with a pair of calipers is the lock plate or the tang on the back of it, things of that nature. So there are things that we do get to do and get into and really get hands-on with the collection. It's more than just wandering galleries looking at stuff behind glass and dusting.
And so you would be just diving into source material and researching the provenance on that. And I as curious as I am to ask more questions, I know that's a rabbit hole that we do not have the time to get into. I guess you talk about taking apart too. Is preservation part of the day-to-day when a piece comes into the museum?
Yes, and it varies depending on what other staff are available. At a bigger institution, you're going to have conservators on staff, and it'll be their job to go through and do the active conservation. But when I worked at the National Firearms Museum, we were a small staff of 7. And so conservation, it was more of just a preventative conservation. We were making sure there wasn't any active rust, making sure stuff isn't binding or gummed up, or there's not, stress on springs where there doesn't need to be or shouldn't be. But in terms of, doing an active, full blown, conservation, restoration, things of that nature, that's not what the purpose of that museum was and not what the purpose of the collection was. So we did minor stuff, just to keep the collection from destroying itself, but not actively restoring stuff.
And so one last thing that I think we could probably get into is I'll do a hypothetical here in the fact that, you might end up getting a donation from somebody who is, essentially an avid collector themselves, and they're donating it to the museum because they want the world to see it rather than it be just, in their own private collection anymore. And so they may have volumes of research they've done. But what would happen if, say, you got an estate sale or something and a historic item gets in and that it's of historic provenance, but how exactly would you go through actually tracking down the information on it, be it a gun or a Chippendale dresser?
Yeah, so thankfully, there are a lot of great people who have come before us that have put together a lot of fantastic reference material on, like I said, whether it, be a single action army or a Chippendale piece of furniture. And the beautiful thing is that while the museum community is vast, it's also small, and we often tend to know those specialists, or we know someone who knows that specialist, and we can get that introduction. So we try to go, as direct to the source as possible to figure out the provenance. For guns, that may be contacting company historians and verifying things through factory letters and things of that nature. So that we can say, definitively, this was Annie Oakley's gun and here's the proof. Sometimes it doesn't turn up that way. You dive down the rabbit hole and you find out that, instead of there being gold in the rabbit hole, there's just rabbit turds in the rabbit hole. And so, that gun that, belonged to Annie Oakley, well, now it's, purported to have belonged to Annie Oakley, or, Family Story says it was, belonged to Annie Oakley. If you can't prove it definitively, the ethical thing is to not say it definitively.
Well, that is awesome. And I wanted to get a little bit more into just that little section of your video. Again, the Ian's video, which is excellent, as well as yours, are in the show notes, as well as a link to your podcast. I just wanted to say, you're doing a podcast now.
Yeah, I am. And because I am an incredibly creative and innovative person, the name of it is very simply the High Caliber History Podcast, just like my company. And you can find that on my website, highcaliberhistory.com, or you can find it on any of your favorite podcast streaming places, whether it's Google Podcast, iTunes. There's a video version on YouTube. But yeah, you just search for High Caliber History in your podcasts and it'll show up.
Yeah, I'll just say as a personal recommendation, I will say that if you like gun nut sort of stuff, I will say that Logan has access to certain people that the other gun nut podcasts really don't, and so the interviews that you've got there are really awesome. I haven't listened to everything just yet, but oh boy, I've enjoyed everything that I've heard.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I'm sure the other listeners here from Assorted Calibers, if you like this show, I think you'll like my show as well.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. That's Logan Medish of High Caliber History.
Thanks for having me.